We're back for Monitoring the Situation, episode 2, with very special guest, Alana. Alana, thanks for joining the podcast.
So great to be here with you guys.
So we're really grateful to have our first Nepo baby, Alana Newhouse of Condé Nast fame. Just kidding. There's no relation. But that's actually a perfect segue to one of the main stories this week. Of course, Alana is also a media mogul. In her own right, running Tablet, and media is one of the big stories of the week. We have the Free Press. A report came out that it's being acquired, or in the process of being acquired. You two are board members of the Free Press. Obviously, you can't comment on any of the specific details, but let's have a more meta conversation on the state of media. Alana, you've thought a lot about sort of the relationship between establishment media and the upstarts and new media. Why don't you sort of comment on your broad reflections?
I think that one of the things that's kind of incredible to realize is that it's only been 5 years since 5 years and a little bit of a couple months since Barry resigned from the New York Times. And it's not only the Free Press that's had a rollicking 5 years, but all of American media and the landscape of American public opinion. And the way that I see it is that there was basically what I call a pyramid of media that at the very, very bottom had hyperlocal print publications. Then you go to like village papers, then you have city papers, major metro dailies, national newspapers, news magazines, consumer magazines, and then the thought leader magazines at the top, right? At the tippy top of that pyramid, those publications had the smallest numbers of readers. They were also the most prestigious.
Mm-hmm.
The bottom has the most number of readers. But together, this print pyramid and then radio and TV come and kind of layer themselves on top of it. The print pyramid basically creates American public opinion for like 50 to 70 years. Over the last 15 to 20 years, that pyramid has been eaten away. And it kind of looks like Swiss cheese now. What's developed alongside it is a second pyramid. That second pyramid is independent media. And the thing to understand about those two pyramids is legacy media pyramid contracts by the quarter, gets smaller, the audience gets smaller, and the work gets less compelling, in my opinion. The independent space is filled with some very, very interesting people and also a bunch of absolute lunatics and nutcases, right? But it expands by the quarter. So now what are we going to do with these two pyramids, basically, that are currently in existence and in operation? And one of the things that I think that rumors of a bunch of acquisitions, not just the Free Press, are showing is actually that there are certain legacy brands that are leapfrogging into the independent space. So I don't see this as the independent media trying to horn their way in to the legacy space. I see it the other way, that this is an attempt by legacy media to absorb the energy and the ethos of people and outlets in the independent space.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think it's very generational as well. Like there's a lot of things we could talk about, and I think we should go deep into sort of the lore of the last 5 years. Because if you are bookmarking where, if we're looking back 50 years from now, I think the state of American media is going to look drastically different than any of us can predict. And we would bookmark it as summer 2020, number of things in summer 2020, but Barry's letter being one of them. Just a sea change for what was happening in media. I actually think we kind of memory hold, like we kind of collapsed this 5-year timeline. But even as I go back through sort of my own experience in media and, 2021, was sort of this time where if you go back to old podcasts, there's still the COVID vaccine, advisory on anyone who's even talking about COVID in a way that wasn't aligned with the with the AMA and with this, the CDC, right? Like we kind of forget that there were whole years, like lost years in that sort of July 2020 to November 2022 time, where there was this kind of burgeoning of voices and people talking about this is terrible. We need to be able to create new things. But like it really, I mean, it really started, I would say, cascading and growing in the way that, if you look at it from startup terms, it's like, that was sort of the seed stage, but like we're really hitting sort of these inflection points 5 years later, which are really exciting. And when you look at sort of the impact that, a couple of really, I would say, sort of cornerstone moments happened, whether it's the firings and resignations at the New York Times, like it was Barry was the one who resigned with the loudest voice, but there's also the firing of James Bennett. Or actually, it wasn't a fire, and he resigned before he was fired because he platformed a sitting senator talking about the riots that were happening after George Floyd and whether it's appropriate to send in the troops. The title was "Send in the Troops." So like people forget that like there were mass cancellations across media, a lot of sort of reshuffling. But where we are now is what I would consider to be a true golden age of new media, and I think Alana described it beautifully, where it's like there's variations in what that media looks like. Swiss cheese is, I think, a good metaphor for there's like probably a lot of missing parts, but there's this sort of, I don't know, startup like moment that's happening in media where people, it's like generational, and there's passing of the torch in terms of people want new, fresh things. But there's also sort of this, how do we now navigate this new landscape where someone who puts out a meme on X can completely control the 24-hour news cycle in a way that did not happen 5 years ago. So it gives independent voices a much louder voice. And I think there is a lot of frustration, sincere sort of questioning at legacy institutions of how do we combat this? And as a former postie, I feel very strongly that they're finally combating it after 11 years of doing nothing when Jeff Bezos bought the paper.
I think that, well, it's actually interesting to watch and see whether or not it's salvageable at this point or whether they waited too long. I think that in order to observe the space and watch for that properly, one of the things that we have to remember is 2020 was a match, but it dropped on Tinder. This was a media landscape that was decaying already. It had been decaying for years and years. People talk about, and many readers, I think, felt 2020 as though it came out of nowhere. And their trust in their legacy media got bottomed out suddenly. But it didn't happen that way. Certainly for those of us who are in the media, I mean, I think Tablet has this really weird trajectory because Tablet starts out as a niche or marginal or cult outlet in the legacy media space. And effectively, because of a bunch of moves that we made half consciously, honestly, I wish I could say I was strategic about it, we ended up becoming the kind of granddaddy of the independent space because I knew I was going to feel much more comfortable there. But in order to understand that, Tablet's 17 years old, right? Our view on media didn't start in 2020. It was already a deeply problematic space. And I'm not sure I think that any legacy brand that survives and that still exists in 10 years or 5 years is going to be because they made a decision to leapfrog into the ethos of the independent space. And again, I don't mean politics. It's not a political orientation. This is an ethos idea. I don't think there's any success to be had for any legacy media outlet in simply trying to live back in that old landscape.
Yeah.
I think it's just death.
Maybe go back. I mean, I love what you said because it is true. Any of us who were working in media, I mean, it was layoff after layoff, buyout after buyout, starting around 2007, at least from my perspective. Maybe it was even earlier for you. Maybe give us the history of kind of what went wrong in legacy media. Was it a business model problem? Was it a cultural problem? Was it a combination of things? Maybe give us sort of Alana's view of the last 25 years of American media.
Well, so my view is a little bit colored by my particular investment in magazines as frankly, I think one of the it's an American art form. Novels are not an American. We have plenty of European novels. Like there are other art forms that we take from other places, but magazines, I think, are truly an American native art form, and I'm invested in them. I think they're different, and I think that they're different organisms, and they mean something different. And I can talk a little bit about what I mean by that, but the thing that was really interesting about magazines is that, and I'm going to bastardize the history just to get it to get us there quickly, but the real problem begins, I think, in the post 60s ad boom. And it happens slowly. It happens in the 70s, picks up in the 80s and 90s, particularly as Wall Street booms, where magazines, and again, none of this was conscious, but magazines at some point made a decision that the primary audience they cared about were the advertisers. And the audience was the means to get to the advertisers, as opposed to the other way around, right? Advertisers were secondary, and they were just things that you sold to your audience. When you make that decision to make your audience secondary, it's a whole host of consequences that cascade from that. And again, you can have decades of boom, decades of massive success, decades of enormously successful journalism. But I think there was a problem in that decision fundamentally. And what eventually happens, certainly for local newspapers, is that they obviously it begins with when the internet begins to eat away at advertising, you start to get a real effect on their bottom line. Classified ads start to go the way of Craigslist. But then all of a sudden, I'll never forget when I was starting Tablet. So this is 17 years ago. Before we launched Tablet, I was at a dinner party with a woman who had just been made the head of digital ad sales at a luxury, very, very well-known luxury clothing brand. And she said to me, you're starting an internet publication. So explain something to me. Let's say she represented Chanel, because it wasn't Chanel. So I'll use that as an example. She said, so the New York Times wants to tell me they have 20 million sets of eyeballs on their stories. Okay, how many of those 20 million can afford a Chanel bag? Okay, let's say it's 4 million. How many of those 4 million ever buy a Chanel bag on the internet? How many? And she starts asking me to stratify the audience. And she said, okay, so then we get down to it. It's 1.5 million possible customers. Why don't I pay for that? And right away I knew that there was just no ad market that was actually going to really be real and sustainable. As the business model starts to come apart, it is my contention that, consciously or not, many of these legacy outlets decided to make themselves feel better with politics. So you take up righteous causes because you're not making any money. You can't actually sustain people's jobs. You can't promise them jobs. So what you can do is, while they're here, you can make them feel like they're changing the world. You can make them feel like they're waking up every day and they are fighting for justice. And so that's how, to me, the politics end up replacing or becoming a Band-Aid over what was essentially a business problem.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I do think that the scarcity in the media culture, one, it leads to, people taking each other down over various political causes, whether it's internal politics or whether it's sort of these grandiose, kind of visions of what people stand for. But I think there was also this quality problem that you and I have talked a lot about, which is, I joined the Washington Post in 2010, and people were talking about how the glory days were over. And there were reporters who had been there, since the 80s and the 90s, and they remember, going out for martini lunches. They remember writing a story a month. They remember, having kind of, I would say, carte blanche to do any story they wanted, where they could fly anywhere in the world and tell a very interesting story. And they saw that as the glory days. And when you're coming off that high, And then there's these young people who graduate from top universities and see this as a prestigious career, right? Because the people who joined in the 80s and 90s did not see magazine writing or style writing or feature writing or reporting. Like, it was not a prestigious career in the same way that it was for these Harvard grads, at the kind of turn of the century. They're, they realized, okay, now we have to compete with young people who are used to the kind of daily grind of the internet, and they're fine. And the word slop didn't exist yet, but they're fine putting out 12 slop stories a day and playing to SEO. And so you had this sort of radical, it wasn't just a political sort of argument that was happening in the newsroom. It was a radical, I would say, argument between the internet native young, we were all in our 20s, very, very, very capable of writing 10 stories a day, versus like these old hands who are just fabulous writers, but not used to the same sort of pace as well. And I do think that led to a lot of it. It's like, I mean, all those people took buyouts. A lot of the people who understood quality journalism left the industry because they were pushed also by this force of, you have to feed the beast. And the beast is not 24-hour news cycles anymore. It's hour news cycles. It's every day updating a website. And that was certainly something I think that kind of brought on kind of the cultural revolution that you saw at the New York Times and the Washington Post, where the young people took over because the old people all left. And the young people had very different views of what it meant to be a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
What Alana said about ads is really important. But when you think about what is this new model, a lot of it is subscription, right? Like, it's like a lot of these new, personalities, whether it's the personality media or it's the kind of new institutions like the free press, like these are fundamentally built on subscription, the idea that people will pay for news. And that was something 10 years ago no one believed.
And let's go into that more, because people said that this business model would change the content. And many people were optimistic and had reasons to be. But one of the arguments was, hey, ads leads to more like BuzzFeed, like content, appeal to the common, so the slop that you were describing, appeal to common denominator. Whereas for subscribers, if you change it to subscription, people will only pay if they're getting real value out of it. So that was sort of the logic. How would you comment on sort of how that's played out, or how the business model has changed the underlying content?
Look, there's a lot of argument about audience capture, right? And this idea that subscription models lead to potential manipulation by mob behavior, and the internet can lend itself to mob behavior much more easily than we had in the 80s, when you had actually had to write a letter, right? That said, I want to possibly present the idea that it is a return back to media that put readers first.
Yes.
And that was as far as I'm concerned, the original sin of post-war American media, was this decision to actually to bring a third party into their relationship. And that throuple just simply doesn't last. Like, it doesn't, yes, everybody makes a lot of money and everybody has a lot of fun for a little while, but that's not a lasting relationship. The lasting relationship, and the reason why I think successful media outlets like the free press are media outlets that are subscription-based, is because in some, not to get woo-woo about it, but in some real way, it's returning writers, editors, producers back into the relationship that they were meant to be in.
Absolutely. And this is why I think the Substack model too, where Substack took a hard line. We are not an ads business. We are you and your subscriber business, and you have a direct relationship with your subscribers. It sort of allowed for fandom, I would argue, to come back into the relationship. And the free press is a good example. Tablet is a good example of this, where your readers are actual fans. Like, they consider themselves part of the brand, right? They consider themselves part of a community. And it is a very different thing than the relationship we had growing up reading media, where it's like you considered yourself, maybe you donated to NPR or you subscribed to the New York Times, but it wasn't a deep fandom. It was more of like a corporate relationship. Like, this is where I get my news. The fandom aspect of what's happening since 2020, since we've returned the sort of paramount subscriber relationship to the business model, it just creates much stronger ties. And that's why I'm so bullish on people can say, oh, well, these are small publications, or maybe they only have X number of subscribers. They're not going to compete with the New York Times, but those ties are so much deeper. Like they have so much more meaning for the customer. And when you think about like in any other world, not media, but think about like in consumer brand or in anything related to tech, it's you want those customers who are just going to fight for you, where they're part of your army. And that is what new media looks like. Like people will fight for the personalities and for the newsrooms that they love.
I also think that there was something that happened. So let me just say something about what I think is if the last 5 years were about a kind of move to the fringes, move to rebels and pirates outside of a mainstream, I actually think the next 5 years, or call it 5 to 10, is going to be about a normalization again. One of the things that Katherine, I think rightly described the independent media pyramid as very, very exciting, which it is, obviously. I would also say that it's a mess. And one of the things that's a mess about it is that there's no hierarchy. And forget about hierarchy as a value in and of itself. There's also no sense of who does what. Like, who does the reporting? Who does the opinion? Who does ideas? Who does taste? Everyone can't do everything, right? And one of the things that was nice about the previous pyramid is that it stratified and everybody had jobs that they did. I think we're going to get back to that, mainly because I think human beings naturally stratify themselves and take on different jobs. We just distinguish ourselves. But what I think is going to be great about that is going to be, I'm a snob. I'm a terrible snob about my writers, about the people who produce stuff for us, about the art that we publish. And I'm a snob about my readers. I think my future looks really good right now as a snob, because the idea of being able to create platforms and audiences that are truly elite, not the kind of elite of mediocrities that we've had in the last few decades, but a real elite, is very possible now. Tablet publishes, we published a 15,000 word piece about Bill Gates in Africa and what his foundation is doing in Africa. It's a very small number of people that are going to read that. But the small number of people who are going to read that are actually going to have their minds changed by it and have their vista on global politics expanded. That means I'm creating smarter brains and smarter. I'm making more smart, already very powerful brains.
Yeah. No, and I think as you mentioned, there's a lot of change happening in media, a lot of mergers, a lot of things that are happening and likely will happen over the next 5 years. And what I think a lot of that business activity is going to do is to showcase that, hey, it's really fun to be a pirate on the internet. Like, it's really fun to be a personality and to have like a one woman podcast. So that's really fun. That is not the that's not the media business. And you can exist as an individual and just kind of run your mouth. But like, actually, like, these institutions are desperate for new properties, for what the antithesis of slop. They're desperate for prestige. They're desperate for new takes that are well researched. And that's because their readers are as well. And we are in this moment where I do think it is a generational shift, right? Like, we have one of the youngest, vice presidents. I think it's the youngest vice president we've ever had. We have, or maybe not ever, but in recent memory, we're having these sort of political sort of, kind of shifting of the generations, where like the next presidential election could be a millennial Gen X setup or a millennial, right? Like, you have the passing of the torch from the boomer era everything to this like very everything's in flux. So people can put their hands up and actually try to build things, but you have to try to build something. It has to be an institution. It can't just be a one woman show. It has to be an institution. And so I think we're seeing that across a lot of different parts of the media and cultural stack. That's very exciting. But it also, I think, is going to lead to a lot of people thinking a lot bigger.
And I think that's what Barry did so well, is that she built an institution that was sort of started as or was also personality driven at the same time. And most
Mhm.
people can't do both. They either try to just sort of white label it and just be faceless, or they just lean into the stardom of one person but can't expand beyond that.
Completely. And one of the things that she found um, was that the amount of talent that wanted to come and build an institution with her was almost bottomless. Like there was so much good talent out there um, that, and I actually think that if she had waited a few more years, there wouldn't have been, because everybody would have left for other industries. And at some point, the glow off of an industry or off of a possible career goes away, right? And so I think she probably caught the last moment where there was real talent to scoop up, and they all found it, and they're going to continue to find it no matter what. It's just it's an incredible testament to institution building.
Yeah. And that people really do want institutions. I do think there was
They
this
do.
moment um, where, a lot of us were blackpilling. I'll say where say several years ago, it's we don't need institutions. We're just gonna, voice or exit. I'm part of the exit train. I mean, I moved to Florida, right? So like I was clearly a little bit more on the we can't save some of these parts of the dying establishment. But at the same time, it's like the recognition when people had sort of that panic moment during COVID. Actually, we do need these institutions. We do need to save things that have been built over generations and centuries, and it's possible.
Guys,
And
yeah, I became known as sort of the burn it all down girl because of
yes, that
everything is
piece with the
broken.
piece, well, yeah, the brokenness piece, which was one of like the sort of essential readings of, I believe, is what 2021 when you wrote it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean,
It was actually I wrote it in March of 2020, but I published it in 2021.
yeah, and yeah, you did have sort of a okay, like yeah, we got to decide what we are. Maybe talk a little bit about the kind of paradigm you put forward there.
But and I'll tell you how I think the paradigm was misunderstood. But the basic idea was behind everything is broken, and then a follow up was that the fundamental conversation in American life was not between the right and the left, or Democrats and Republicans, or even between conservatives and liberals. The dominant conversation that I saw happening was actually between people who deeply believed in the sense-making institutions of American life, media, universities, and also including other institutions, our healthcare system, the government, and those who believed that those systems had become irrevocably damaged or decayed. And the conversation between those two groups was the one that I found to be the most generative, and also the one that I found was like the one that had the most heat coming off of it, and those conversations I left smarter. Um, but because of those two pieces, people assumed, and I with good reason, but they just assumed that I was like, burn everything to the ground. But that's not really right. If you actually read the piece, what I say is that we need to look at these institutions and assess them for health. Some of them we should abandon. I actually don't really think that anyone should spend that much time or energy burning anything down. It's just useless. But you should abandon the things that are not actually going to survive or serve you or serve other people. Which ones should be reformed and which ones should be conserved, where we actually work to preserve them? And so it was a broad plea to look at institutions and assess them for health, and not just assume that because they had been there for your whole lives that they were actually serving you properly. But the thing that I think we're looking at now, I think Catherine's completely right. We just had 5 years where everybody grokked this, and everyone was like, okay, we have to look at these institutions with a real skeptical eye. We have to abandon them. We went pretty far out. Think we probably have a little farther to go. But we went far. We've gone far in 5 years. But I do think that we're in for a kind of normie revolution. I think we're in for a pivot where people start to want to institutions. They're going to want mass media again. They're going to want things that feel like when they say a lot of people, like when you have an opinion, you can feel like a lot of people have that opinion too.
Yeah.
And I think the increasing excitement or verve or prurience of marginal spaces is starting to wear thin.
We've been talking a bit about Slop in this episode. You know, we just had Vibes last week launch and Sora this week, and so there's kind of a broader commentary on sort of the future of content there. Alana, you have a piece on this. Why don't you sort of share your reflections?
Yeah. So the piece is actually the editor's letter for our November print issue. And in the editor's letter, I try to traverse a moment. So it can be about a couple of different pieces in that issue, or it could be actually about stuff happening in the wider world. The cover story in that month's issue is actually about pig farming, and it's particularly about the use of something called gestation crates, which is this incredibly horrendous instrument. Mainly, it's a linchpin of factory farming, and it's a horror show. And it's a horror show from a bunch of different angles. Various states have actually passed laws outlawing gestation crates, and the federal government is considering overriding those states in a support of companies for an instrument that is incredibly unethical. And so it's bizarre, right? This is an instrument that favors the federal government over state governments, favors China over the US, is completely unethical. The evangelicals hate it, as well as anybody in like Maha who is concerned about chronic disease.
Mm-hmm.
And as I thought about it, and I thought about how we think about what we take in and what we bring into our lives, it felt more and more to me like we have this slop in, slop out economy, personal economy right now, where we just take in a lot of shit in every part of our lives and then produce a lot of shit. And something about it feels, I mean, it obviously feels to me deadening and depressing. But it also feels worth thinking about whether or not the two things are related. So I pose in this piece that our inability to judge or discern slop in what we're bringing into our lives has led us to not really be able to discern slop on the internet, slop on digital spaces, and to know whether or not we should care about it, bring it in, actually engage with it. I'm really curious. I know Katherine probably disagrees with me, and I'm curious to hear her argument, because then I want to fight with her and tell her I think it's all about the absence of God, but I'll get there.
Everything comes back to the absence of God. But yeah, no, I think, no, I agree with what you say. I mean, I think in some ways if the LLMs have taught us anything, it gives us a better understanding of the human mind, and that what you train yourself on, right? Like with the kind of information that you take in, it completely, transforms your worldview. And so the garbage in, garbage out model, like we 100% know that, right? Like that technologists know that better than anyone. If you train on bad data, you get a bad product. So in some ways, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Where I'm more sympathetic to the kids are going to be okay slop argument is, I was watching a podcast the other day, and there was someone on, I believe it was Sean Ryan's podcast, and there was someone on, and he was saying, like kids use their phones 7 hours, or actually adults too, but it's 7 hours of raw consumption a day. And I remember the exact same stat being used in the 90s, because I was part of the 7-hour-a-day television consumption world, right? Like I watched 7 hours of TV a day, and it was mostly slop, right? Like sure, you could make the argument that Law and Order created a generation of like really, hard charging prosecutors or whatever, right? Like, but we were all watching this same stuff. Like I would, get home from school, watch Boy Meets World, then watch some game shows. During the summer, I'd watch some, like CBS dramas, built for housewives, right? Like you like soap operas. Like you took in a bunch of nonsense. But I always like look back at my sort of, worldview now, and I'm like, well, this is why my worldview is very different than a lot of the people I interact with, because most people who are watching 7 hours of television a day are not operating in the tech world, right? So there's something about, okay, there's like a utility to having kind of bathed in slop that gives me a kind of a normie attitude that maybe I wouldn't have if I had parents who weren't policing me and like, or if I, if I had parents who were a little bit more engaged in what I was consuming. So I think there's something, I don't know. I guess I have a little bit more of an attitude of the kids are going to be all right. And we've made this movement from television to slop engines, but it's still going to be okay because the kids are going to know how to metabolize it. Maybe I'm being way too hopeful, but I do think that there was the same sort of fear of television, definitely in the 90s when, I was told that I was going to amount to nothing for how much television I watched.
Yeah, we don't actually disagree that much. What I guess I would say is, and maybe um, here's where numbers actually make a difference. Um, what I'm concerned about is I don't know how many kids are going to be able to take in 7 hours of AI generated content, which, by the way, I do think is different than TV. Um, and save their brains. A certain percentage absolutely will, but I don't know if it's going to be as big as the percentage that could save themselves from TV. And I don't know whether or not, and maybe that's okay, right? Maybe we just create a smaller minority of people whose brains can take in lots of different kinds of nutrients from the world. Something about living in a country of 340 million people and basically being like, maybe it's okay if only a million of them are all right, doesn't strike me as
Is
right.
the right way to architect a society. Yeah, no,
Correct.
I guess, yeah. And I'd love to hear Eric's thoughts on this too. I guess there were guardrails in the 90s. Like this is the thing that I think doesn't exist with the internet, that like if I'm going to make the other case, if I'm going to make the side for the other case, like this is very true. Like when I was 13 years old, I had to go to Blockbuster and
Yes.
check out the slop. There was friction. There were also guardrails, right? Like I wasn't allowed to check out a porno. I had to check out, a PG-13 movie that was made directly for 13-year-olds consumption. The thing that is missing in a lot of not only, the kind of existing slop, but the AI slop is that like unless there are strong parental guidelines or unless there are people looking over your shoulder, you can go very, very quickly down a dark hole, which everyone recognizes. I mean, like I routinely experiment with how like which holes you can get down just by clicking certain words. Like everyone understands this. So I do think it's the parallels with the 90s are definitely not as strong as I'm making them. But I also worry about the language that is used and kind of codified to sort of demonize some of these products. Whereas
Yeah.
it's like, I see how I'm using AI. It's very useful in certain aspects and not slop because I'm prompting it not to be slop. So I think that there is something there too that's often missed in the conversation of it. It doesn't all have to be slop. Maybe that would be how I would write it. It doesn't all have to be slop.
I've become sympathetic to Jonathan Haidt's arguments around sort of your cell phones for kids. And maybe schools should, sort of earlier schools shouldn't have them in. But at the same time, I worry about kids not being able to develop immunity to these products. I look at my dad who discovered Twitter later in life and just can't get off. It just is like so addicted. And if he had discovered TikTok, Jesus Christ, he like, yeah. So people need to develop immunity to these products. And Tyler Cowen had this line about the internet. He says it makes smart people smarter and dumb people dumber. And I think you could extrapolate that out to sort of like, people who are well adjusted and have, sort of are able to filter information and like it's a superpower and it makes you better. And for people who have, it's like a comorbidity, like, like for people who have other challenges or vulnerabilities, it can, exacerbate them or prey upon them. And so, it's high variance.
I also think that there's a way in which, and this could um, be a rubric for a lot of conversations that we three could have. I think there's a way in which we don't have answers for what to do about big radical moves that don't include the government.
Yeah.
Like the conversations about all this stuff, in some senses, we all start getting breaking out in hives, because part of what I think, one thing that I think the three of us share, I assume, and I could be wrong, is that what we don't want is government regulation around these things. That's what's scary. It feels like, oh God, if we start to black pill enough about this stuff, then the government comes in and
It's
it
our
starts to
Twitter war.
regulate it. And if we could take that fear out of the conversation and imagine that that was never going to happen,
No.
then what systems do we have in place as a society that could, in a healthy way, put the brakes on things, or maybe even direct us, make it better, make it so that people were smart enough before they got to the technology so that it made them smarter,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's a big missing layer of conversation in a lot of hot button topics right now.
Totally.
There's a little bit of a Mott and Bailey where you were talking about sort of the critique of institutions. Instead of sort of assessing the critique, some people deflect and say, hey, you're just undermining belief in institutions, or you just want to burn it all down, because they don't want to sort of assess the critique of it. And we've been talking about sort of blackpilling and how people are tired of blackpilling.
There are a lot of emotional reactions that people have that I can tolerate. And then there are a couple of them that I just find very, very annoying. And I find there's a particular kind of blackpilling. There's one flavor of blackpilling that really gets under my skin, which is the person who ignores the problem for years and ignores all the very good people trying to direct their attention to it. Then the minute it shows its face, that person's hair gets on fire. They freak out. They're outraged. They're shocked. And then, because they can't actually change the entire world in 11 days, they're then like, oh, it's all over. And you're just like, every move here emotionally was fraudulent. And I feel this way particularly because I live in New York City, and the emotional process I just laid out is the process that many people have had around our mayoral election. And at some point you just look at them and you say, are you gonna ever learn? Like, you have to actually engage, and you can make things better.
Yeah.
But you do have to do the work.
Yes.
And freaking out as soon, like fire alarm politics, is just dismal. And really, it's like the thing that annoys me the most, I think.
Yeah. I think that is a perfect encapsulation of what's happening in New York City now. And as a resident of Florida, I fear for the number of people who are going to make the decision to move. Given the politics, given their reaction to the politics and to the waking up moment you just described.
I feel like we have to segue into the politics of aesthetic. Ozempic earlier. You talked about the normie revolution, Alana.
Yeah.
Katherine, we've talked offline about Vivek's famous nerd versus jock. Christmas. Hullabaloo on X, and we've talked about how this admin is the jock administration. Pete Hegseth had the speech this week to the military. There's a lot to get into. Katherine, when you talk about what you found most striking or remarkable.
Yeah, I mean the sort of news of the week that was all over our X feeds was the fat shaming of the military speech. And it's interesting. The reason why I think it's so fascinating is, of course, I work in the world of aerospace and defense, and a lot of people were sort of putting out their theories of what was going to happen, right? Like why are all of these people getting together? Why is all the top brass in the military getting together in one place? And I think there were people on who haven't been necessarily following the optics of this administration, who thought, oh, we must be going to war. Right. Like that was sort of and I would say a lot of mainstream media actually put out that narrative, like this, if we're having this kind of big powwow, there must be something extremely important happening. And sort of my internal view, which was vindicated, is this is an administration that understands the importance of aesthetics and of drama and of what was called the pseudo event in the 1960s, when television first started. Right, there's a great book called The Image, and it's all about these how do you create pseudo events that then lead the news. And I'm always of the opinion like these things are much more pseudo events, especially if they're planned and if they're organized. And I think that the politics of aesthetics that are on display when you say, okay, like it matters what our generals look like, or it matters that a lot of our administration has had a television career, right? Like I think one of the things that's most interesting about the Secretary of War is that he had, a decade on TV, and he looks the part of someone who is a global war on terror veteran, right? Like he's tattooed, he looks very different than the previous generals who've had that role, or the previous people in the department who've worn that suit, right? So there's something about this administration that deeply understands that aesthetics matter, and it kind of harkens back. I think it's in some way fitting, but like the kind of politics of aesthetics started with JFK. It started with the advent of television. And now we have an administration that, of course, was born from, like the president spent how many years on TV. He understands that medium. And so we have to view every event. We have to view every political event through the medium of the people who are putting it out. And it's like it's aesthetics, it's television. It's, it's the Fox News look, right? Like everyone has the same look. Like there is something about understanding the world through that aesthetic prism. And what's interesting, and that's sort of the last point on it, is I think young people get that. Like, I really think young people understand it because they've been in a sort of mimetic universe for their entire lives, and they understand sort of the importance of image and memes, and that like the kind of way things look is very inherent to how they are. And so I think a lot of the people who were predicting, that it was going to be a really big, momentous event, it was interestingly more about sort of aesthetics and making sure that the people who work at the department are in line with the aesthetics.
I would also say that I think that you're picking up on this idea of a pseudo event, I think is really important, because one of the things that we've seen with this administration is a lot of times the most important things that happen, nobody actually knows are going to happen. And what I find useful about that is that in both instances, let's use two things as examples. One, Israel's strike on Iran. Two, Pete Hegseth's announcement last week, right? Israel's strike on Iran, not announced before, right? And Pete Hegseth's announced to great fanfare, lots of preparation, lots of people. In both instances, what was so great were the number of people who seemed absolutely sure that they knew what was happening. And one of the things that I think this administration, some people in the administration, I think definitely are conscious of this and know it, but some of them I think are just simply just do it naturally, is I think that they're throwing into sharp relief the mediators, meaning the media, the people who tell us how to understand what we're seeing. And they are making fools of a lot of them because they're wrong a lot. And they're wrong in both ways. And the aesthetics is super important because you could see who falls for them and who doesn't in all sorts of directions. So I think it's very skilled politics, their approach to aesthetics, both when they use them and when they don't. You can like the effect of them or appreciate the consequences or not. But what I think Katherine is saying that I think is really important and actually really interesting, and very few people are really thinking about it clearly, is that these are people who think deeply about what images are and are not getting put out. And I think it behooves those of us who claim to analyze them and to observe them for readers or for audiences to get smarter about it and be able to serve our audiences in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah. A lot of that means reading the memes.
It does.
Is it interesting? I mean, on the point of the memes, I remember, speaking of like massive pseudo events. Remember the JD Vance on the couch discourse, and how people thought that that was like some sort of real blow. And it's funny because JD Vance the other week, he just embraced the meme, right? He quote tweeted the image of him like puffed out, and it's funny how there's sort of this back and forth war on the memes, and how people can lean into them or out of them, or sort of
Yeah.
it's similarly like Kamala's, what was it, the coconut tree, or I don't know, something that was cute at one point became kind of a symbol of like frivolousness. The next week, it's funny how the symbolism can change.
And it's funny how quickly it dissipates, right? But what's important is that the meme dissipates. Sometimes it gets brought back, but a lot of times the meme and the effect dissipates, but it changes us. And it maybe in unspoken ways, but some of us get more skeptical, and some of us just keep buying the manipulation. And it's interesting to see who's who, basically.
But one other just sort of funny cultural comment thing that happened was, Emma Watson, sort of Emma Watson, complimented J.K. Rowling, or said, "Oh, I still love you," and J.K. Rowling like wasn't having it at all. She was like, "You were not there for me in my time of need. Now you're, sort of sucking up to me because it's more popular to do so. But I've been through absolute hell, and I needed courage in 2020. Today I don't need it." And it's just funny she didn't let her have it. Like, people are trying to sort of, just distinguish that these are different times, and where were you on, at these moments?
I also think that there's something else at work. I think that's right, but then there's another thing, which is say you're sorry. Like, you don't get to be a leader who people listen to and get something wrong and then not take responsibility for it. You do, but then you don't get to earn everyone's trust. I think what Rowling was saying was, take responsibility for what you did. Whatever you did in 2020, fine. But if you want to be taken seriously now as somebody who people should follow and listen to and take direction from, the first thing you need to do is acknowledge what you got wrong. And what I think she saw Watson doing, or at least it's certainly my read of her, was pretty cowardly. It was wriggling. It was like, well, I want to see everything. Well, I want to, everyone should love everyone, and we should all be able to see both sides of everything. And you're just like, what? Like, say you're sorry. And to me, there's just this, I feel this way a lot with COVID.
Remember the piece of The Atlantic that was like, truce, like, hey, both sides got things wrong in COVID. Like,
my thing is why would I listen to you again?
right.
If I feel you're just going to take me down another road that was wrong, right? So when COVID was I think the time when a lot of us experienced this en masse, where we had authorities or people that we trusted telling us that it was very, very, very important that we all stay inside in a pandemic of an airborne virus. And that we had to close down schools, and we had to do everything. Like, they issued these proclamations with such surety and such a sense of confidence. And then they never, ever said, here's what we got wrong, and here's how we got it wrong and why we got it wrong. And then they turn around and say, why is there so much mistrust? All you people are crazy. Well, what do you mean? Like, I needed you at some point to at least tell me that you saw that you took a left when you were supposed to take a right. Because how do I know that at the next stoplight, you're not going to do that again? And to me, I mean, I obviously feel that way about a bunch of different things, about a bunch of different people and media. And, another good example are all the people who yelled that before the Iran strike, that this is going to be World War III. And I get it. I get all the fears that go into that. I completely understand it. But when it's not World War III, you then have to come out and say, I got it wrong. Otherwise, I don't see why I should trust you the next time there's a geopolitical event to have any instinct that is reality.
One of the things that I think is so great about markets and investing is that there's a track record if you're right, and it's marked how early you were. And as someone who takes that very seriously, I really like to remember if you're early and right, and I really like to remember what I got wrong, right? Like I like that's intellectual honesty. And one of the things that I think X has truly given us is that is the same metric system for media now, because at least now there's receipts. There didn't used to be serious receipts, or it used to be much more difficult to go back to the archives of various news stations and be like, hey, this is what people were saying, right? But like now any person can do it and be like, this person said this crazy thing, and they haven't apologized. And I think you're right. Like we now have the system to track, but there is this hesitancy, and I think the Emma Watson thing is a good thing. Like the heroes will be villains, the villains will be heroes, and I think it's like good that she is called out as like, hey, you weren't an early believer. You didn't stand by your friend, or you didn't just like, I mean, I think the thing that J.K. Rowling said that was beautiful was like she could have just shut up, right? Like just not said anything, which I think is very good advice for most of us. Which is
Say
people know we're
nothing.
on a podcast, maybe just stop talking if we don't if we're not totally sure about something. But that is of course not the times that we live in.
But I mean, and I think that the problem is that, the reason why the conversation has the power that it has in the valence is because you're dealing with two celebrity women.
Yeah.
Right. And so Emma Watson's comments go viral, and then Rowling's riposte goes even more viral.
Mm-hmm.
So then we can all see the receipts, right? The problem for me with X is that the receipts don't go nearly as viral
As they should,
as
yeah.
the original post. Again, I fundamentally fall out where Katherine is, which is like, it's all going to come out in the wash, and we are going to find our way through it. But finding our way through it, I think, in part, includes acknowledging what's going wrong with it.
Yeah. And that it's a messy, messy moment. I will say the receipt that J.K. Rowling put out, because she is the best writer to ever exist, is, I mean, it will go down in history as one of the greatest receipts. Like 10 years from now, we could be talking about what is one of the greatest takedowns of someone who backstabbed you. That paragraph was just beautifully crafted, and I aspire one day to be able to write something so beautiful.
But I don't know if you saw, it was so classic. Cernovich replied and was like, "Okay, now do migrants." Like,
I know.
now, and she's like, "You're still here?" It was amazing. Well, with that, I think we should wrap. It's been a fantastic conversation, Alana. Thanks so much for joining us.